Welcome back to the Baby in the Crib. This will be clip number 6. I have a few people that I want to talk about on this clip. I want to go back though for a short minute on Daniel Luzzi. Daniel Luzzi, like I had said before, worked for Mayor Hague in his office. For some reason, I don't know, my family is convinced that he worked as Mayor Hague's right-hand man. Like I said before, he was listed as being an elevator operator, but my father insists that he was, pretty much into the politics there with Hague, so I'm not really sure. So what I did was I went back and I searched him a little further. There's not too much on him. Most of the family that really knew him are now gone, so it's difficult to get information from others. But according to the census on him, he came to Jersey City from Italy somewhere in the early 1900s, somewhere around maybe 1910, 1912, somewhere around there. But anyway, his first listing was on Pine Street. There was an awful lot of Luzzies at that time that lived in that area. And he was there with his brother and some of his sisters and his mother and father. Then the next address shows for him on Lafayette Street. Now, Pine Street and Lafayette Street are only a matter of up the street, maybe a few houses and around the corner, so they're very close together. From where we lived, he was only a block away. Now, it shows that he lived there. 1920 census show that he was married, and he was listed as working for the city and City Hall as an elevator operator. 1930, he shows the same thing. He's still in the same house. Still working for the city, still listed as the same thing. Now, more records that I looked into shows that in 1930, he also had an address in Denville, where eventually that family did move to when they moved out of the city. But he lived in the area of Spring Lake. Now, I talked about this before because right down the street from him was another police officer. Well, I shouldn't say another police officer. A police officer that lived there that was from Jersey City. His name was Mansur Kerstead. They only lived, according to, looking on the map, if you type in both addresses, it looked like the streets there circled the lake, and they were only maybe, if you had to estimate, probably about a block and a half apart from each other. So my guess is that if they moved that close together, they were friends. It looked like quite a few of the police officers later on in time moved down in that area. But anyway, when I found this other guy next, living close by him, that name kind of stuck in my head. And I thought, that name sounds familiar. Like most of the research that we did, you come across a name after a year of searching, and it would sound familiar. And then I'd have to go back and look to see, and sometimes it took weeks to find, But this is what happened here. I knew that name was familiar. So I thought to myself, okay, now I've seen this name before. Daniel worked for the mayor. Let me go back and start checking out the records for the mayor himself. Sure enough, it's listed on his census for 1910 that he has his nephew living with him. And that nephew's name was Robert Kerstead. So that was where the name sounded familiar to me. Robert shows that he lived 1900 census is in Newark, New Jersey. And that is, now he's listed as his nephew. It's a very, very large tree. Most of Hague's family on his wife's side were all from Newark. So, at this point, I'm guessing that that's how they're related is through his wife's family. She came from a very big family. Um, so it's listed there for 1910. He's living with Hague. It's Frank Hague, his wife, his son, and this nephew, Robert Kerstead. Um, so I figured, you know what? Okay, let me check out this kid. I really at that point it was just I didn't think I was onto anything, but I just wanted to see who he was. So I looked. 1920. It shows that he's in Idaho. Um, he was 23 years old at that time. Now, when he was living with Hague, he was only 14. It looks. I try to research him back further, like before that. His father's listed as George, and then I find a George in 1910 being in a penitentiary. So that could be very well, the reason why maybe he was staying with them. I don't find mommy anywhere anymore. Maybe she passed away and dad was in jail, so they took him in. He was only 14. But in 1920, he was out in Idaho. He was listed as a deputy collector for the Revenue Service. He was listed as a lodger. He lived with, I think the family's name was Young. He lived with that family. It was himself, and then there was another boarder um, that was there that lived with them too. He was listed as a dentist. And I know there's a school not too far from there. Maybe, he was attending school. It's not clear really what he was doing there. He wasn't living with relatives. He was just boarding in someone's house. Also, he was married then. In 1920, it's listed that he had gotten married. Now, in 1930, it shows him in Minnesota. No, correction, Missouri. He's listed as an accountant for public service. Now, when I say public service, I don't mean the utility company. It's listed as public service. I don't know if he worked for maybe the state or whatever he was doing. Now, he's married. He's remarried by then. His second marriage. So when I looked at this, it was just not, nothing important, just to get a background on him. Then I realized that I went back in, there was quite a few times, and this was a while later. I went back in and looked at the 1930 census again. He was in St. Louis. Now, why I checked that was because at this point in the research, and this was quite a while, probably a year or so into the research, with Lindbergh having, the spirit of St. Louis, he was involved. And I thought, let me go back and check and see if there's anything, where he lived, whatever. So the census show that he lived at 275 Union Boulevard in St. Louis. I believe his rent at that time, it shows that he was renting. He was definitely in an apartment building. I was able to view the building. It's still there today. A large apartment building. The rents, he was paying $110 a month rent there, which was a little expensive back in 1930. A lot of the other apartments ran about the same, as some were $150, some were $200. Some of the people in that building had servants, so I'm guessing that, it was an area, it wasn't a rundown area anyway. And I decided then at that point to start looking through the other pages. And I came across at number 320 Union Boulevard for 1930, Charles and Anne Lindbergh resided there with the Knight family. I looked into the Knight. I believe that the man listed there that they're living with was someone that funded him in a project that he had done. I don't believe it was for his flight, but he had something to do with, he was involved with Charles Lindbergh in something that he was working on. But yes, now, I mean, Kerstead is at 275 Union Boulevard, and Anne and Charles Lindbergh is at 320. I brought them up on the Google map. They're listed as being 12 seconds apart from each other, both in apartment buildings. So at this point, I realized, here's a young guy, Frank Hague's nephew, is traveling all over. He's out of the state by the time he's 23 years old, which back then wasn't unusual, but he winds up in 1930 living right next door to the Lindberghs. I knew at that point that this was worth searching for. I was sure at that point that I would definitely find more information. Okay, so at this point, I mean, is this a coincidence? Hague was known for sending people out to keep an eye on others. Is this what this was? Did he send his nephew in 1930 to live close by the Lindberghs to keep an eye on them, to see what they were doing? Thank God nothing happened to them. So, I mean, he could have sent them there for anything, but obviously, as we know now, he might have been just keeping an eye on them to watch what they were doing. The funny thing about this, though, is this is 1930. It's after the threat on Dwight Morrow's daughter, Constance. It's before Dwight Morrow dies. So now someone's watching the Lindberghs. I mean, someone wanted to, kidnap Constance in 1929. Now in 1930, newly married, here's someone possibly watching them. And then the next year, Dwight Morrow dies. It's just, the time frame is kind of suspicious. We know from Enrico Girardi that that man was sent to keep an eye on him, on the family. I mean, he lived in 3 locations close to that family, and they were convinced that it was someone, had him watching the family. Now, with Robert Kerstead in St. Louis, 12 seconds away from living from the Lindberghs, was this the same thing? Was he there to keep an eye on their moves? After finding this, I shifted my search back into Hague again. I focused a little bit on the Zeppelins, his elite squad of police officers that were his bodyguards. Through records, a name kept popping up with Hague, Daniel Casey. Now, to me, anything that I read, it would seem to me, if anyone, Daniel Casey could have very well been Hague's right-hand man. It seemed like he was with him a lot of times when he was out and about. He was a police officer, so it could have very well been, So I did some research on Daniel Casey. What I came across was he lived in the city all his life. He was originally from Massachusetts. He lived in the city all his life. He was married. He had no children. I also, doing the search on him, a lot of travel records came up for him. There was a lot of trips back and forth in the early days, back and forth to Ireland. So there was quite a few that I checked. It seemed like he was with other men. He never traveled with his wife. It didn't seem like it was a vacation of any sort. One showed a sister traveling with him. But it seemed odd. These trips would be once a month. They were very frequent. And there was one trip that showed him with another guy named Murphy. And I checked him. He was listed as a police officer also, as a detective. Now, I searched both of them for travel records. I focused on the travel records. Now, Murphy, in early time, before Hague's time as the mayor, Murphy was making multiple trips to Ireland. Some were on an average of every 2 weeks, back and forth. It could have been a connection with liquor. Maybe they were bringing it back from Ireland. I don't know. I don't want to assume that that's what it was, but there was an awful lot of records back and forth to Ireland. And then it seemed like Murphy and Casey kind of overlapped each other, making trips very few together. Then it seemed like Casey kind of picked it up, where maybe they didn't send Murphy as much. Now it was Casey that was going for whatever reason. But like I said, it seemed like if one group wasn't going, another. Now, on a couple of them, I, took the names that were with them and, checked them. And yes, they were coming back to Jersey City too. They were matching, their names and their date of births. So obviously they were doing something. You just don't go away on vacation that often. But I would guess that it had something to do with liquor, that they were going into Ireland and maybe having it shipped back. Now, these records are ship records. They're not, they weren't train or whatever. They were ship records. So chances are they were going and maybe bringing back the booze with them. That's unclear at this point. Okay, so at this point, I'm thinking Daniel Casey is probably one of Hague's Zeppelins. So I try, I was looking through records to see if I could find anything that listed my uncle with maybe Casey, but there's nothing. There's nothing. If they were Zeppelins, both of them, and I'm going to say that my uncle definitely was by the name we called him. They didn't work together. There's nothing that shows them together, Actually, Casey was from a different part of the city, a different ward. So it could very well be that at one time he was, police officer, but maybe involved in his ward, where my uncle was down where we lived. The ward leader down there was Fleming, which I wanted to mention him because there's a book out about him, Teddy Fleming. It's written by his son, and if you're interested in this, reading that book is very good because it gives you an idea of how the politics worked back then. His father was very much involved. I'm sure my uncles knew him very well. They only lived a matter of blocks away from each other. Um, but it gives you a good idea of how Hague worked. Um, and there's a couple of things in the book that were pretty interesting, and I'm going to bring them up later. It's not, I don't want to confuse the daylights out of you, but it's a very good book to read. It, you know, of course, it's about his father, so it talks about when he was in the war, and you know, but the part that he writes about the politics is very interesting. It gives you a really good idea about Hague and about how things were done at that time. Okay, so the next area that I searched in or started was a family tree on Hague, which would make sense, you know. And what came up was well, the family with the well, not the Kersteds. There's a lot of Bennetts that started to come up. That caught my eye. Reading through the FBI files on the case for the Lindbergh kidnapping, there was a mention of the Bennett brothers. I think it was Robert, and I forget the other one's name. They didn't give much information on them. The only thing that was, you know, there was talk within the jails that the Bennett brothers were involved in the kidnapping, the Lindbergh kidnapping. The only thing that was listed for them was that they were out of New York, and they were known to have 2 apartment buildings there. They were bootleggers, and the one or maybe both were used as distilleries. They were doing, you know, the liquor right in the building. Now, both of them were in Manhattan, both addresses. So I figured, well, you know what? I'm seeing a Bennett in the family tree here. Let me see if I can find the address. I mean, I ran for Bennett, and a ton of them come up. It's really difficult to search that way. There's just too many of them. So I decided to, if I could get close enough on the census records with the street, that maybe I could follow. And actually, that took probably about 2 months to find. It was very difficult. Just when the numbers were starting to get closer, it would change, and then that would be the end of the record. Some of those records were 50 and 60 pages each, and by the time you click through all of them, the number would, you know, not be there, so I'd have to start all over again. But like I said, it took about 2 months, but I did find it. I finally found the one address of the Bennetts. Okay, so like I said, there's 2 addresses for them. The one was number 69 West 55th Street in Manhattan. And I believe the other one, I never did find that second address. It was West 60 something, something like 62. It wasn't all that far away. But I did find the one on West 55th Street for 1930. It shows that a Josephine Bennett lived there. And she had a roommate who was Richard Brooke. He was from Massachusetts, and Josephine was born in Connecticut. But that's all information that shows. It doesn't show her here as working. It's listed, she's a female divorced. She was 49 years of age, living at that location. There's other people in there, but nothing that sounded familiar or matched any of the people we were looking for, or people that were listed in any of the records that we had read. So I did research on her. I did a family tree on her, which took quite a while. She comes back. I traced her back to when she was married. The name of her husband doesn't fit the two names that were listed in the FBI records. But I decided to do a family tree, a complete family tree on her, to see if there was any names that did come up. Searching her back, she shows, I believe, as having, I think her middle initial was D, like David. Well, not David, she's a girl. But it was D as her middle initial, which some of the records, when when I was finding them, one of them had listed as Day, D-A-Y. Now, that name sounded familiar because I came across it doing another family tree. During this whole research now for 3 years, I must have 25 family trees. So, then I'd have to look back through all of them to see where that other name shows up. Now, as I researched further on her, a record came up for her as being Josephine Beach Day Bennett, which then that name Beach sounded very familiar. So now when you research her back to her family tree, she is related to Drusilla Beach Day, or Day Beach. When, back in those days, they used to take the family name and put it in as a middle name, so it gets really confusing, but sometimes it's very helpful, because when you're searching like this and a name comes up, I would stop and then research it back to the family that had that name and check it to make sure, if they were related or not. Okay, so in the tree, Josephine's husband is listed as Martin Toscano Bennett. That is not one of them. But, back then, I found records that they changed their names. I don't know if they did that purposely, or they just, if they got tired of one name, they'd use another. But anyway, that's who she was married to, and, they come from a very big family. So in fact, they're from Connecticut also. That's, I'm sure, how they met. Rhode Island. His father was born in Rhode Island, and his mother was born in Connecticut. Now, Josephine is from Connecticut, so that's probably, they met there. But anyway, now on Josephine, she's Josephine Beach Day. Researched it back. She's related to a Drusilla Beach Day. Now, Drusilla is not a common name, and as soon as I seen it, I knew that she is somewhere in my family tree from another family. Research it back. She's married to Alexander Kerstead. They're related. Josephine Bennett, from the FBI file of number 69 West 55th Street, is related to Drusilla Beach Day, who was married to Alexander Kerstead. In 1930, the two of them are residing in Jersey City. Okay, so records show, correction, because I said they lived in Jersey City. It wasn't both of them, it was just her. He passed away, Alexander. They were married in New York City. They lived in New York, in Hancock, Delaware County in New York, for quite a few years. He died in 1890, and it was her that lived in Jersey City after his death. Now, together they had 2 children. They had Alfred and they had Everest Kerstead, living in Jersey City. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, you know, she's related to the Bennett that's in New York. His nephew is Robert, who is living 12 seconds away from the Lindberghs in 1930 in St. Louis. This is not a coincidence. To me, it's not a coincidence. That address, that exact address, 69 West 55th Street, was listed in the FBI records for the Lindbergh kidnapping investigation as one of the Bennetts who, through, like I said, jailhouse talk, that, you know, they heard that the Bennetts were involved in the kidnapping. The address that's listed is the exact address that I found the Josephine Bennett living, which can be traced back to relatives of the Kerstead family through marriage, but, you know, still relations. And so now I need to search everything. At this point in our, you know, our research, we needed to search everything. Who knew what we were going to come up with next? To me, it's not, you know, it doesn't prove that any of these people did anything wrong. Like I said, how many times before, it doesn't prove that they did anything wrong, but it shows a common link. That common link is Frank Hague. And all along, I thought to myself, there was a reason for that dream. That baby, after finding this, when I did, I knew in my heart that baby was in my home. They brought that baby to my home. And, you know, whatever happened after that, it's good to know that that child, the dead child that they found under the tree in Hopewell, could not have been the baby. I'm convinced now that that child was in my home. I know that child was there. And these connections are substantial. I mean, I'm linking here Josephine Bennett to Drusilla Brewster Beach Day. You know, they thank God they were using all those names. Back to the Kerstead family. Now, at this point, that seems like a lot. There's still more connections to this family. And I'll be right back with the rest of them.